Okay, welcome back to Labbing It. Today is time for the vCenter installation and configuration. Um, in today's video, we're going to install the vCenter server appliance to our only ESXi host. Once it's installed, we'll quickly configure it up with our data center. We'll configure a cluster of one host for now, and then we'll just enable a couple of important features, the HA and DRS. Not that it's pretty negligible at the moment when we only have one host in our environment, but we will add a second and third ESXi host as we move along. So just to have a quick look at the network. So as you can see on the far left there, we've configured an ESXi host, and we've attached storage via the HPE virtual storage appliance. That's VSA 1. And inside the ESXi host, we configured up the networking, including a port group called VM network. That's where our virtual machines are going to live, and that's where our vCenter appliance is going to live. And if we sort of just blow it up a little bit more, just a small little diagram just pertaining to the VMware environment. You can see there on the LAN segment is where our physical environment is. We've got our pfSense box. We've got the 192.168.10.0 network. So VSA1 lives there, and so does ESX1. And under ESX1, we've got a virtual network called VM network, and that's going to be attached to the vCenter server appliance. And obviously, as we move along, we'll build some more virtual machines on that VM network. So that's where we're going to start. I've downloaded the ISO already, so we can get straight into it. Right, so to install vCenter, we need to mount an ISO. And I've already downloaded the ISO on my lab server. So this is it here. We installed our ESXi host with 6.7, and we're going to do the same with vCenter. So generally speaking, our vCenter needs to be of the same or higher version than our ESXi host. So if everything's on 6.7, everybody's happy. So we'll start with 6.7. And what I'll do is I'm going to install it from this client machine. I'm going to go into the settings of this machine. I last installed Office. Now I'm just going to change that. Let's drop down to the VMware folder and look for the vCenter install. So that was the ESXi installer. This is now the vCenter installer. And we'll go OK. So assuming the ISO is all okay, we should be able to open it. And we go into so I use the graphical installer to here, and we'll run this as administrator. Probably not very intuitive for the first time installer of this, but straight into here, Win32, and the installer. And immediately we have some options here. Granted, this is a greenfield environment with a single ESXi host, a brand new install. So we don't have any vCenters running anywhere in our environment. So we're not restoring, we're not migrating, and we're obviously not upgrading. So we are just installing. So it's just a matter of following the prompts here. It's pretty straightforward. It's a two-stage process. So stage 1 is the preparation of the appliance itself, and then stage 2 is the setup of the appliance. So we'll quickly whip through these options. Happy with the agreement. Now we are running 6.7, and the way that vCenter used to be recommended for configuration is to split vCenter up into its two main components. That's the vCenter server itself and the platform services controller. The platform services controller managed a few features such as certificates, authentication, and those type of things. The recommended approach now, they quickly changed it back, is to run the platform services controller as an embedded component to vCenter. So it's an all-in-one. I'm not sure if there's ever a need to use this feature, the external platform services controller. As it says there, clearly it's deprecated. It's a deprecated model, not no longer supported. So we'll go with the embedded. So that just means that we're only going to have one appliance instead of two. And the first thing now is going to ask us of the host to which we want to apply this or to install this appliance. So I only have one host, and that's its address. And I'll use the root account for that host. I have a previous video of setting up this host, so if you needed to take a look at that, you can check that out on my YouTube channel or via my website, labbingit.com. You get a certificate warning. I don't have certificate services set up in my environment just yet. That will be coming, and we'll be updating our environment with proper certificates to get rid of these security warnings. Now it's just asking for the virtual machine name. So this is how it's going to present itself in the web interface. I'm going to call it mel-vcsa. That's mel-vCenter server appliance. And the server appliance also needs a root, or has a root account, and you need to give it a root password. We generally use the root account when we need to configure the appliance itself. This is not going to matter too much in my lab environment. I'm not going to ever have more than 10 hosts. I definitely won't have 100 virtual machines. It says they're up to 300 gig of storage. Oh, that's okay. That's 300 gig worth of storage is required for a tiny implementation. It will be thin provisioned, so there is an option to thin provision this, so it won't utilize 300 gig. So I go with the default settings. Now it's just asking which data store. So just be mindful, there is a local data store on my ESXi host where the operating system is running. There is the potential to install virtual machines onto that data store, given that it's only 20 gig in size with only 11 gig free. Should be enough to recognize, hang on, that's not going to be a good place to install a virtual machine. Here are our dedicated data stores that are running off our virtual appliance, storage appliance. I'm going to run this on the gold data store. And just a reminder that there's gold and silver here, but essentially it's all running on the same virtual disk. There's no actual tiering, performance tiering actually happening in this environment. But I've just for labeling purposes, I've just called this gold. I will enable thin disk mode. We're not using a vCenter cluster. That would mean we'd install vCenter in a slightly different manner. This is all perfectly right now. Next. Now here it's going to ask for the network settings. I only have one network, that's the VM network, and if we have a look at my diagram, there it's listed there between ESX1 and Mel vCenter server appliance. So that's pretty straightforward. IPv4, it's a static IP that we're going to assign. If we go back to that diagram again, the IP address is 10.20. Now, one thing I like to do, actually before I go ahead, is just update DNS with a record for this new host. So I'll just punch in mel vcsa and the IP address, which is 10.20, and done. Back to my client machine. Now we can give the actual full name, LVCSA, and 10.20. The subnet mask is 24-bit. Gateway is 10.1, and we have one DNS server, 10.10. And 8443 is fine. So it gives you just a quick summary of what's going to happen. So this will be stage 1 in effect. This can take a little while. Just before I might pause the video, we could actually go into our host, ESX1, and if we log in, we already see a virtual machine being deployed, which is what's going on here, deploying the appliance. So this will take probably about 10 minutes to complete. Once it's done, we'll come back and continue to stage number 2. Okay, stage 1 is now complete. So we'll just proceed on to the second stage. There is the ability to stop it at this point, and we can resume via this address, which is the port 5480 of the new vCenter appliance. That's known as the vCenter Appliance Management Interface, or VAMI for short. But we're going to continue on. Loading stage 2. And next. Synchronize time with ESXi host. That's what I generally configure. Every environment might be a little bit different how they manage their time services. SSH is disabled. I just enable it. This is a lab environment, so if I need to access the appliance for any reason, I just want to be able to do it without having to log into the said VAMI and enable it from there. So I'm just going to do it now. So this is just the probably the key part to a vCenter setup, is that we create a vCenter domain. So it is entirely separate to our Active Directory domain, so our jtairlines.internal domain. So we're going to create one specifically for vCenter. It's a requirement by default, and I don't know many people or many organizations that differ from the default, but vsphere.local is the often used domain name, and you'll see as we start using a bit more of VMware why we have a domain. It's pretty straightforward, really, but it is a requirement for our installation. By default, it creates an administrator account, just like an Active Directory domain would, and we just need to provide a password. And the best way to know if we're talking about vsphere.local is when we're talking about VMware SSO domain. So when it says VMware SSO domain, it is talking about vsphere.local. And I'll just punch in the password and confirm password. You might also, if this was a secondary installation of vCenter, we could actually join a second vCenter to a already created SSO domain. That's a common practice for probably larger scale organizations that have data centers in multiple different locations. You might have many vCenter installations and you want them all under the same SSO domains, which means that you keep authentication the same across many environments, which is quite handy and easier to manage. So we'll go with that. Saving parameters, and again, this is a lab, no need to join this improvement program. And looks like we are ready to complete the second stage of this installation, which probably takes about just as long as the first stage. So I'll click finish and we'll see you at the other end. Okay, all done. So I'll click close and it will automatically open up a browser to connecting to the vCenter server appliance. So unlike here, we've got mail esx1.jtairlines.internal. So if we need to connect to the host directly for any reason, that's the way we would go about it. But primarily, we're going to be managing our VMware environment from the vCenter mail vcsa.jtairlines.internal, which will manage this host as well. So let's log in. Again, we do have security warning messages here. We're going to fix that up. And here we log in with the administrator account. So administrator at vsphere.local. We can integrate with Active Directory, and we will do that at a later stage. But just for now, we're just going to keep it simple, just the one administrator account. And with that, if we do integrate with Active Directory, then we can use a sort of a single to log in with our own accounts. So here's vCenter. Now, if you're not familiar with vCenter, there's not a lot to it, to be honest. I mean, there is a lot, but at the same time, in terms of what we want to configure up, there's not much specific that we really need to do. Obviously, we can dive in real deep and do all sorts of things, like I said, with Active Directory integration, for instance, as an example. But here we've just got our main view, our hosts and clusters view. We don't have any clusters or hosts configured here. In here we'll see a list of all of our virtual machines inside our vCenter, which we have none at this stage. And the reason why we don't have none is that we need to import the ESXi host. So whilst we are logged on to vCenter, that vCenter actually lives on this host. This is where it's actually being managed from. And in vCenter, which is this virtual machine here, we've not configured anything up to say, hey, I want to see all the virtual machines on ESX1. So we'll do that in a second. So we have no data stores and we have no networking. So to fix all that up, we need to import our ESX host. So the first thing to do is we create a data center. So we'll call this the Melbourne data center because that's the network that we are in. Oh, I don't know whether to use RE or ER. I feel like in Australia we're supposed to use RE, but I'll just keep it nice and simple. Okay, you might have just heard my cat in the background. I'll just quickly pause the video. He's going a bit deaf, so his meows are quite loud. So we've got our Melbourne data center. Click OK. So a data center can consist of hosts and virtual machines, clusters, networks, and data stores. And so we could essentially just place a host here in our data center if we wanted to. But generally speaking, we will separate our hosts into clusters. And in this case, we're only going to have the one cluster, and I'll just call that production cluster. I'll just leave those options off for now because we'll manually enable DRS and HA once we've got our host up and running. And now we have a production cluster. So in a data center, we might have 20 hosts in a production environment, and perhaps 15 are for production use, and maybe 5 is for test and dev and management use. So you might have a couple of clusters in a data center, and you manage those hosts in a different way. In this lab environment, we're just going to have the one cluster, and in a cluster we can also add our hosts. So that's the Mel ESX1. So we'll just type that in. It's the root username and the password. And next. Just gives us a security alert again. Again, we don't have certificates configured. We will do a later video. We get a warning message, and I think that's just primarily because it's telling us to hang on, there's a virtual machine already running on this host. We already know that. It's the vCenter. We're okay with that. It's going to just import it all in. And we'll let that go. You got this recent task view down the bottom here that you can expand, and you can see what might be going on in your environment. Looks like it's already completed the tasks we set out to do. The vCenter VM is there now. Just waiting for this host. It's in italics. I suspect there's just a few things it needs to configure for itself in this environment. There we go. Now it's sorted. And here, as you can see there, I'm just clicking on a refresh button, so you don't have to refresh the browser per se, unless something's going horribly wrong with the console view. Just hit the refresh button here. So now we've got a little bit of information now of our VMware environment. Got our vCenter, we've got our data center, we've got our cluster with our host, and this host has, it's actually not this host. I mean, this host does have that virtual machine, but this virtual machine also belongs to this cluster. So they're sort of listed in a row, as these are all being managed by this cluster. And if we go into our virtual machines, now we can see that we have a virtual machine. So we can, in this view, we can organize our virtual machines into folders, perhaps, just for easier view. I'm not going to worry about that too much because this is pretty straightforward with one virtual machine. You see our data stores. The Melbourne Data Center consists of 3 data stores: the ESX1 local data store and the 2 data stores that are connected to our virtual storage appliance on Mel VSA1. And we know that our virtual machine, I believe, lives on this data store. So if we click on it, we can see what VMs are on this data store, and there it tells us, Mel VCSA is here. It's pretty straightforward. Our networking is pretty simple. We have technically one port group for our virtual machines, and we know that the Mel vCSA is attached to that network, and we can also click on here, and we can get a little bit of information about the network, the network that it lives on, the storage that it's using, what host it's running from, what cluster it's in, get a little bit of information around the VMware tools running on the guest, DNS name, the IP address, and we can also console this virtual machine. So I don't have a physical access anymore, or never did. So the only way to console is through either vCenter or through the ESXi host. We'll just do a web console. This is a bit of software that you can install on your machine. I highly recommend it, and I will install it at some point. But just for now, I'll just do a quick web console, and you can literally manage this vCenter appliance from here. If I hit F2, let's see if it does anything. Might just need to fix up my function keys. There we go. And we can use the root password to log into the vCenter. I won't worry about that. There's nothing I need to do. So that's so this is the vCenter itself. So this is managing the vSphere environment. If you have to manage the vCenter appliance, you can obviously do it through the console, just as I showed a second ago. The other alternative is to go through the VAMI, which is on port 5480. We can go to here, 5480. And we can log in with the root account, because this is directly to the appliance, not the vSphere environment. And we can get a little bit of info. Here we can actually manage our vCenter. We can do updates from here. We can reboot the server from here, the appliance, if there's something going wrong with it. And you can also check, obviously, the health status and a few other things. There is one thing that I like to tick off in here is to disable the root account password expiry. So after 90 days, the password expires, and generally speaking, there's no way to reset it without logging into the console, rebooting vCenter, and using the grub interface to actually reset the password. Can be quite annoying. So I turn it off. Definitely in a production environment, you probably wouldn't. You probably leave that set to yes, and probably push out some warning messages to say that passwords are expiring to reset them prior to actual expiry. Yeah, there's nothing much else in here. Access SSH is enabled, so we can SSH if we need to. We can manage the networking from in here if we need to change IP addresses or update DNS servers, which we will do in a later video, because we'll add a secondary Active Directory domain server. Anything to do with firewalls, time services, I don't really change. Get a bit of an idea of all the services here. Granted, if you're in this environment and you're in this interface, probably the services are running okay. And yeah, we can also check for updates and do some updates to our vCenter if required. And this one here, a good feature if you want to back up your vCenter configuration. If something goes wrong with your vCenter, you don't have a backup of it, you can always install a new vCenter and just apply the configuration back to it. So this is always a good. We'll actually have a go at this. I don't know if I've actually set this up, but it's definitely a worthwhile thing to do. I know that some of my colleagues highly recommend it, so we might have a look at that in a later video. But that's it at the moment. I think vCenter is all set up now, so the next task will be to create a virtual machine template that we can utilize to build additional virtual machines. I've done a template for VMware Workstation. The process is pretty much exactly the same, so I'm not going to go through the whole procedure, but I'll just show how to manage templates in VMware and how we can build a virtual machine from it. It's quite simple, and it's a massively time-saving task if you have your templates already configured and ready to go. But for now, thanks for watching. We'll Talk again soon.